Good morning, good morning. So much more energy. My last class was like a sweet with the weight. I'll take it. This is your weight. I like it. I want to talk for just a minute about Wednesday. So I did grade all of your first part of the papers that you submitted. So the vast majority of you got 10 points, and I did a lot of feedback unless there was something you were missing. The citation. Keep building on that. The next part of the paper, we'll have lots of time to talk about that. We're going to go to the library one day, or maybe have it done virtually. We're still kind of working that out. Where we'll talk about APA formatting, and we'll talk about sources. So we'll build up to that second part a little bit. But I graded most of the first ones, or all of the first ones, I should say. And then Wednesday, we do have our first exam. And we talked about this a little before, but I just wanted to remind you that on Wednesday, we won't be meeting in person. Right, so on Wednesday, it is our first test, and I've given you the time during our class to take it. It's 75 minutes, which is the amount of time that we meet. The exam will open up at 12:01 a.m. and close at 11:59 p.m. So you can take it at any point on Wednesday, but you do have this period of time to take it. So if it's a busy day for you, take it during our normal time, and it'll just be like you did it in class. If you want to have a little extra time, you can take it in the evening or the afternoon. It's totally up to you, but it will close at 11:59 p.m. So just make sure you've completed it by that point. So if you're on our course homepage, if you click on modules up here, you can see right here is the first study guide. Okay, so here's the study guide for exam number 1. So if we click on that for just a second, open up. So that first exam is on chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which we'll cover today. So the first 5 chapters, if it's on the study guide, it will be on the test. If it's not on the study guide, you don't need to worry about it. So I've created the exam, and then I went through and I wrote every term or concept from the exam on the study guide. So anything that's on here, make sure that you're familiar with it, that you know it. The vast majority of the questions are multiple choice. And then there's some true, false, and a couple of short answer questions. But the short answer questions will never be essays. They're going to be things like, what are the 5 Ds of abnormality? They're going to be lists of things, or the 4 humors according to Hippocrates, things that have kind of told you along the way. It's typically going to be like lists of things or comparing 2 things, but never essays or anything like that. So as long as you have prepared and studied, you should be in fantastic shape. The exam is not that difficult, I don't think. I think it's very clear and straightforward. I've written all the questions myself, so they definitely cover what we have covered in here. So there shouldn't be any surprises. And if you know everything on here, you'll be in a fantastic spot. Okay, so I expect a lot of A's on here because you can use your notes, you can use your book, you can use anything at your disposal. But I would really, really encourage you to study. If you're trying to look up every answer, you are going to run out of time. Okay, and that's a little bit purposeful. If you were taking it in class with no notes and no book, it's more than enough time. And even on here, the average, usually people finish right around an hour, and you have 75 minutes. So you should have plenty of time. It should go really well. I know exams make everyone anxious, but you get to do it online with your notes in your book, and you should be in fantastic shape. Okay? And again, there'll never be any trick questions. Something's confusing, read it again. I want you all to do well, but please do prepare, study, and don't wait till the last minute on Wednesday. Please, please, please don't wait till like 10:30 at night to take it, because inevitably the second you do that, right, the power will go out, your internet will go out, you'll get sick. I don't know, something will happen, your computer will break. So just try not to wait till the last minute. Take it at our normal time or anytime during the day before 11:59 p.m. Okay. Are there any questions at all about the exam? Anything that I can answer for you, or anything to make you feel Better? Are you feeling okay about it? Because you can use your notes and everything. You don't look too anxious, which is nice. I'm doing this for at least one more semester. After this semester, I'll probably go back to in-person tests, but I wanted to make sure that everyone felt as comfortable as they can as we're still kind of transitioning back to normal. Yeah. So if you go here and you click on quizzes, this is where you will go to take the exam. It has 82 questions on it. Okay, so it's like a little less than a minute per question. So just make sure that you're keeping that in mind, watching the clock. Again, the average amount of time people take is right around 59 to 62 minutes. So in the class I had last semester, that was the average. So it should be plenty of time, but if you don't know an answer, skip it and come back to it. The true false ones should be really fast and pretty obvious. But if you don't know it, skip it and come back just so you don't run out of time. If you run out of time, it will just stop you wherever you were at. Shouldn't happen. Usually people have fun with it. If you haven't studied and you're trying to look up those questions, you might find yourself a little tight on time. Anything else for now? Yeah.
You know, one thing about all of us, and I think I speak for the class, is that we're learning about the abnormal, but really the ideal is normal.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering,
or the norm.
if you might reinforce that all that we're studying what is different, but we're looking for the normal, and might just simply give us all things.
You know what? In my experience, because it's online and because we have your notes and your book, I mean, there are very few people who don't get for this for the things. And also it's really important to me that you all do well. And so I think I've set you up for success with the study guide and the questions and everything. I feel like you all will do quite well. We'll see how it goes, but usually the average is very high for all of those reasons. So I can tell you that last semester, the average was like a 91, which is really high. There's a lot of A's. So you've got this, and I've got your back, but make sure that you study a little bit, and you should end up with an A. That was a very admirable effort, though. I liked it. I'm sure you weren't alone. That's a good one. Oh, no, I think it worked pretty well. And again, I did spend a lot of time debating, and I think by putting it online, I don't see any reason you shouldn't be successful. Really, if I don't, it sounds harsh, but if you don't do well on this, it's really due to a lack of effort on your part. I've made it very easy for you. You just need to make sure you're prepared and studied. You should be in great shape. You really should be. Yeah.
Will it be from chapters 1 to 3, or will it be from like chapters 1 to what we finished today?
1 through 5.
Okay.
Right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. Anything else for now? Any other questions? No.
For us.
Yeah, if you were doing the test in person, I usually collect the study guide for extra credit, but since you can use it on the test, it won't be extra credit. But doing it is probably a really good idea. Okay. If it were me, I would write every term on there out and I'd have it in front of me. And then it's just ridiculously easy. It's right in front of me. I can reference it during the test. Okay. All right. So let's go to chapter 5. There aren't actually that many disorders in this chapter, but there are some really interesting disorders in this chapter that we'll talk about. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about how stress affects the body, not too long, but a couple of minutes. And then we'll talk about a couple of disorders related to extreme stress, like acute and post-traumatic stress disorder. And then there are a few dissociative disorders, which are often the result of extreme stress and trauma. So again, we'll spend just a few minutes on stress and how it affects the body, and then kind of build from there. And we just finished talking about an exam, so you're probably in that frame of mind of stress already. Sorry for that. But stress is something that college students are notoriously familiar with, right? We're all probably more stressed than we want to be or should be. It is a state of psychological tension or strain. Also, the process by which we perceive and respond to certain events that we call stressors. And a stressor can literally be anything from an exam to traffic, to money, to family. It can be anything that causes us stress, we would call a stressor. Yeah. This one is disorders of trauma and stress. Yeah, of course. And the interesting thing I think about stress is that it's more how we appraise an event than the event itself. Every single one of you in here probably responds differently to the idea of the exam on Wednesday. Some of you might be incredibly stressed by it, others not so much. It depends on how much your grade matters to you, how prepared you feel. Sitting in traffic stresses some people out and other people not at all. My partner hates traffic. It's like starts swearing at the people and yelling at people as they're driving by. My kids imitate it all the time, which is awful. Like, I can hear your mom. They'll be like, come on, what are you doing? I'm like, that's your mom talking right there. Versus traffic for me doesn't bother me because I always am ridiculously early to everything, right? So it's more about how we view and appraise an event than the event itself. But anything can cause us stress. And when we are experiencing stress, there's a lot of stuff going on in the body, right? Stress affects us physically. It affects our body. It affects a lot of different systems. So when we experience stress, and I'm going to kind of summarize this in a slightly different way up here on the board. When we experience stress, a structure in the brain called the hypothalamus is the first thing to be activated. Right? And the hypothalamus is this tiny little structure in the brain that regulates our homeostasis or kind of balance. It tends to also trigger a lot of different systems into action. So when we experience a stressor, whether that's an exam or traffic or something else, right? A death in the family, money, anything. When we experience stress, the hypothalamus kicks into gear and it activates two different systems in our body. One of them is the autonomic nervous system. And the other is the endocrine system. The autonomic nervous system is part of our nervous system structure. And I have a picture I'll show you in a minute if you're wondering where that fits in. But the autonomic nervous system plays a really big role in a lot of our involuntary activities, right? A lot of things that we don't necessarily think about, but they happen kind of automatically. Autonomic, they're very similar. If that helps you to remember it, that helps me to remember it. The endocrine system is made up of a lot of glands that release hormones into our body, right? So both of these systems become activated whenever we're experiencing stress, whether it's short-term or long-term. Now, the autonomic nervous system, and we'll talk more about each one of these, I put up this kind of like division of the nervous system. So the nervous system divides into the peripheral and the central nervous system. The central just has the brain and spinal cord. I say just, but they're two very critical, important things, right? The brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system divides into the autonomic and the somatic. And then this one divides again, right? So we can add this over here. We can say it's made up of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, right? And these are in charge of things like fight or flight and rest and digest, right? So we have a lot of different parts of the nervous system, but if you're wondering where the autonomic kind of falls into that, here it is. It's part of the peripheral nervous system, and it actually divides yet again, right? So both of these systems become activated, and they're going to work together, but in slightly different ways. And that's what we'll talk about a little bit more on the following slides, how they work together, but in a slightly different type of way. Questions or anything so far before we kind of elaborate just a little bit more? So the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are here, right? Part of the nervous system. And what all of these do together is they gear us up to face a stressor through something called fight or flight, or freeze is the other one. Flight, fight, or freeze. Say that 5 times fast, right? But they gear us up, they arouse us. So when there's a stressor, these things kick into gear and they release neurotransmitters throughout our nervous system, right? Neurotransmitters like norepinephrine is a really common one. Right, which plays a big role in arousing us, getting all of our resources mobilized, helping us to face a threat. right? When we are stressed out or scared, or even in love, we actually have all these same very similar responses. But our breathing picks up, speeds up, our palms start to sweat, our heart beats faster, digestion shuts down. We get those like butterflies in the stomach kind of feeling as the blood is pulled away from our stomach to reroute so we have more energy to fight off stress. But what we get is all these things happening, and then when the stressor goes away, the other side of the coin, the parasympathetic, calms us down. It's in charge of resting and digesting, which sounds much nicer than fight or flight. But it calms us down after a stressor has passed. So this one side of the coin is the nervous system. Neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and others arousing us, getting us ready to face a stressor. On the other side of the coin, the endocrine system is made up of a bunch of different glands. And these glands release hormones. And hormones travel through the bloodstream in a very like slow, long-lasting kind of way. Neurotransmitters are very, very fast. Hormones and glands work on a much slower, longer lasting level. But they work together. They're happening at the exact same time. So this side of it, we sometimes call it the Hpa pathway. Right here. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal pathway. Pituitary and adrenal are glands. They're different glands in our endocrine system that are going to hormones like ACTH. All of this is going on in your body, right? There's like this fast response controlled by the nervous system and the neurotransmitters, and then a very slow response controlled by the glands and hormones like ACTH and cortisol. And so when we're stressed, we feel it, right? We get stomach aches and headaches. You might feel jittery, right? You might feel exhausted, especially if you're dealing with stress on a very long-term level. It can start to take a toll on your body because all of this stuff is happening kind of behind the scenes. So, I mean, that's really as deep as we'll go into it. There's a lot of really interesting books on it. There's a really cool book. It's not the easiest read, but if you're interested in this topic, it's called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's a great book about how stress affects our system, especially like long-term stress. I'll write it over here just in case you are interested. Again, it's not the easiest read, but it's really interesting. The Body Keeps the Score. Well, I didn't write that very cleanly, but The Body Keeps the Score. It's a pretty new book. It's just a few years old, and it's all about how stress affects our system, especially like in a long-term kind of way. And if people experience stress at a young age, how that can actually affect this process throughout the rest of your life. Really interesting book. So what we'll focus on for the rest of the time is a couple of different disorders related to stress. And with all of these, rather than talking about like normal day-to-day stress, we're talking about extreme stress. Extreme stress like a trauma or a traumatic event, or maybe something really bad that happened. We're not really talking about like normal, typical stress. We'll look a little bit more at how like typical stress can affect the body with a few smaller things in the next chapter. But what we're focused on more here are disorders related to extreme stress. And there are really two big ones. They're talking about adding another one, which I'll mention at the end, but acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder are the two main disorders related to stress. Does everyone have that? Yeah. Do you have a question? You sure? Okay. So both of these disorders are very, very similar. The biggest difference is how long they last. And that's really the only difference between the two of these. Acute stress disorder is shorter lasting. Now, it might not be the most sensitive way to remember it, but the way I remember it is, oh, it's just a cute little disorder. Like it's small, it doesn't last as long, right? Whatever helps you to remember, right? But acute stress disorder and PTSD are both brought on by a traumatic event. Now, a lot of people experience traumatic events and they don't ever develop either of these. Sadly, a lot of us at some point in our life will experience something traumatic. It doesn't mean you will get a disorder from it, but it's definitely possible. Right? So an acute stress disorder is when people have things happening right away after a trauma. So something traumatic happens, and within a very short period of time, within 4 weeks, they start to experience a bunch of different symptoms that we'll talk about in a minute, but they only last about a month. Acute stress disorder is incredibly common. Let's say you have a really traumatic car accident, and right away you have a bunch of symptoms developing. You don't want to drive, you're having a hard time sleeping, you're having nightmares about it, but it only lasts a couple of weeks and then it starts to go away. This is a very short lasting disorder versus PTSD can be something that lasts forever, right? On average, it's like 5 to 7 years after a trauma if people get treatment, but it can be something that does last for a very long time. So really the only difference between these is how quickly they start and how long they last. Again, this one starts right away and lasts less than a month. This one can start months or years later and tends to last for a very long time. Anyone in here have someone in your family or even yourself who suffers from PTSD, just by show of hands? A good amount of you. Unfortunately, it tends to be relatively common, but any stories or comments or thoughts? A lot of you raised your hand, what this looks like or what happened or anything at all? A lot of you raised your hand. Yeah.
I mean, I would say for me, like, what I've like been through in the past, like, I like to look, I like to like turn around a lot,
Okay.
and like, I can't really talk about what's happening, but sometimes I still feel like, you know, someone's kind of fucked up, like do something. Like,
Sure. And that looking around a lot and having that, it's something that we sometimes call hyper vigilant. It's like you're always on edge.
yeah,
And it makes you really hard to relax, especially if you're worried that someone will sneak up on you. Maybe that's the trigger. It's like that constant, having to look.
it was worse for you, like, you,
Sure.
so
Yeah. Anybody else? Someone in your family or yourself? Any other stories or comments about PTSD? Used to be called, while you're thinking, if you want to say anything, it used to be called shell shock syndrome. That was the original name for PTSD, shell shock syndrome. And it was thought to be only related to combat. Right. So what we noticed was people coming back from combat situations would have these host of symptoms. And so we called it shell shock syndrome related to that. But we noticed later that it could actually be triggered by anything that the person perceives as traumatic. Right. So the trauma could be combat, it could be a natural disaster, it could be an assault, a terrorist attack, right? It can be anything that you perceive as traumatic. A car accident could be traumatic. Right. And so what happens is you experience this trauma, and then it's almost like it haunts you in a way. Right. I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. It's like it sticks with you way longer than you want it to. And you start experiencing a wide variety of symptoms. You re-experience the traumatic event. This could be nightmares, hallucinations, flashbacks are very, very common. You think about it all the time, even when you don't want to. Right. So something traumatic happened to you and you can't stop thinking about it. Right. And that's normal for a while. Right. Like if you got into a car accident, I would argue that it would be completely normal to not want to get into your car and drive again for a time. Right. My partner, gosh, this was before we had kids. So like 11 years ago now, we lived in the valley at the time, and she went through a light and somebody ran the light. She was turning left and somebody ran it and just absolutely like plowed right into her. Yeah, right. Happens all the time in the valley, right? That's why your insurance rates are so high in the valley, right? Turn left, bam, right into her. My poor partner, every time, even now, 11 years later, every time she goes through an intersection and turns left, I see her go like this. Like she like hunkers down expecting me, right? And I wouldn't say that's abnormal. If you got in a car accident when it was raining, maybe every time it rains, you think about that and it comes up in your mind. Or you had a car accident at night. Every time you're driving at night, maybe it pops into your head. But when you start avoiding driving because of the trauma, then you've kind of reached another level and you're starting to get at this. You're having nightmares about it, flashbacks about it, and so on. Or maybe you refuse to drive altogether. So unfortunately, traumas are relatively common, but having this intense response doesn't always happen. You tend to avoid anything related to it. So if it was a car accident, you might not drive, or you don't go through the area where you got in the accident. You tend to have reduced responsiveness. Sometimes people shut off and it's almost like they're in a fog and they're far away and distant. Other people can have that hypervigilance like you were describing. It's like you're always on edge. Your arousal level's really high. You can't calm down. There's a lot of anxiety and guilt and sometimes anger. But the flashbacks and nightmares and like thinking about it intrusively are really one of the most common portrayals of how this can show up for people. And again, the combat was the big one, right? Stereotype of this is a car backfires or a firework goes off and somebody is like instantly back in a war situation. They get all sweaty, their eyes are big, right? And they're right back to it. It's kind of like the stereotypical presentation, but it doesn't always have to be combat. It can be a wide variety of things. I have a little clip from a movie that is related to combat. So just as a warning, it does have a guy who was in combat situation, and so he has trauma from that. It's from American Sniper. If you've seen that movie, it's brief. Nothing. Won't see any combat or anything like that in here, but there's nothing there, right? He's kind of reliving that trauma in a way. But that's a good example of that like hypervigilance piece. Like he can't calm down. He's on edge, right? Very easily activated. A lot of those different symptoms. I always think of Punisher as well. If you ever watched the series, The Punisher, the main character like had a trauma happen. He kind of constantly hallucinates it and dreams about it. There's a lot of examples of this in the media. Some of them related to combat and some otherwise. Katniss from the Hunger Games, I think, is another great example of someone struggling with PTSD of like a popular pop culture character. But with all of these, you're experiencing these symptoms and they tend to last a long time, unfortunately. It tends to be something that for many people can last for years, and they might have little elements of it that last even longer than that. And I want to mention one side note. There's a disorder, and it's not in the DSM yet, but it has been accepted into what's called the ICD. It's Europe's version of the DSM, and it's called CPTSD. The C stands for complex. Complex PTSD. So with PTSD, it's traditionally one traumatic event. CPTSD or complex PTSD is someone who experienced multiple ongoing incidences of trauma. And it might be lesser traumas, but they lasted a long time, traditionally during childhood, right? And so people who suffered from CPTSD have slightly different presentation of symptoms, but a lot of the same stuff we just talked about. But it's more that they had complex, ongoing, smaller traumas like neglect or abuse as a child. And that can be another way that this can present. It's not a formal diagnosis yet, but it is something that I wouldn't be surprised to see in the next version of the DSM. It's gaining a lot of popularity. So a trauma is obviously enough to be traumatic in itself, but not everyone who experiences trauma develops a disorder. There's a lot of people who react and then they're okay and they move forward. And there's a lot of factors that play a role in that. It's hard to know. Every single one of us could experience the same event and we're all going to react a little bit different. And that's just the nature of people. We all react to things on a slightly different level. Some of the factors that might play a role are biology, right? Some people are more sensitive to anxiety and to traumatic responses than others. Right? Maybe it has to do with the neurotransmitters and hormones that you release. It could also be a little bit genetic, right? So there might be a propensity to have higher anxiety sensitivity, which might make you more vulnerable to PTSD or ASD, acute stress disorder. Your personality plays a role, right? Some of us can handle more stress than is like healthy. Like we can handle it, like pile it on, like I can handle it. And other people crumble at the smallest amount of stress. Right? So your personality, how resilient are you? How much can you handle? Right? That plays a role in whether you develop a disorder or not. Childhood experiences, if you had trauma as a child, you might be more vulnerable to PTSD, especially CPTSD, right? If it was ongoing, right? So people who grew up in levels of poverty or low socioeconomic status might be more vulnerable to developing a disorder. If you have good social support, that helps. It's a protective factor. Something bad happens to you and you have other people you can talk to about it, especially quickly, that tends to minimize your likelihood of developing a disorder. And so having social support is a good protective factor and helping you. There are cultural factors. Certain races and ethnicities are more vulnerable traditionally to PTSD. And a lot of that has to do with kind of cultural elements like growing up in poverty or low socioeconomic status. But we do see higher rates in certain groups of people. And some of that is more like systemically than anything else. And then the severity of the trauma. The more severe the trauma, the more likely you might be to develop a disorder from. Now, again, not everyone is going to develop PTSD. And these are some of the reasons why you might or might not. Theories anyway. Yeah.
With the proviso that that's a generalization, what groups would have a higher propensity?
Yeah. So people growing up.
Proviso that generalization.
Sure. And people growing up in poverty, or low socioeconomic status. What we see are people who are like Black or African Americans who have higher rates of PTSD because they tend to stereotypically grow up in higher rates of poverty than their Caucasian counterparts. And that totally depends on the person, the part of the world, and really other factors, right? Kind of a big blanket statement. But there are higher rates in certain groups. That's a great question, though. So it depends on a lot of factors whether that would happen. So a couple of things that we can do to treat PTSD or ASD. Typically, the only way that people get over and process PTSD is to go to therapy for it, right? And you have to kind of go through the disorder and what happened over and over again. When I was a therapist, I had a client, or training to be a therapist, I had a client whose partner was sexually assaulted at night in her car. Okay? My client wasn't assaulted, but she developed what's called secondary PTSD. She was afraid to get in her car. She was afraid to be out at night because of what happens with her partner. Right? And we had to go through it over and over and over again. So it's like you're taking the power away. You're desensitizing that person to the trauma. And so oftentimes if you don't process and work through the trauma, it won't go away. It'll fade over time, but it might not go away entirely. And there's a very common treatment for PTSD and CPTSD and some of these trauma-related disorders called EMDR. So you can have EMDR for your PTSD, right? If we want to go with crazy with the acronyms here, right? But EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. EMDR years ago was not scientifically validated, but it has become more and more validated and more commonly used for people suffering from trauma. It's a really interesting procedure, right? And it's not necessarily a one-time thing, but what happens is we use some kind of bilateral stimulation. Bilateral stimulations, which could be your eyes. It could also be sounds or little buzzers or tappers. And you follow a light back and forth or a therapist's fingers back and forth, or you hold a tapper in each hand and they buzz on each side. It's stimulating both sides of the brain. And while you're doing that, you think about the trauma and you just kind of let it go wherever it goes. The idea with EMDR is that that traumatic event got stuck in your brain. It hasn't been processed. So what we're going to do is we're going to activate those links in your brain and try and unstick them, right? Work through it in some way. And I found a little clip that explains this, I think, pretty nicely. So I'll play it for you. This tends to be something that is kind of commonly misunderstood, right? There's some kind of negative belief that you develop. And through going through and like thinking about it over and over again, paired with this bilateral stimulation through either eye movement or tappers or sounds, it starts to fade a little bit. And then you come up with a positive belief like, I'm in control now. I wasn't in control then, but I'm in control now. And when you slowly start to believe that over time, the trauma fades and the new stuff replaces it. It's like it gets processed or absorbed in your brain in a slightly different way. It's a very common treatment for EMDR. It takes time though. They said about 3 months. That's for a single traumatic incident. Someone who has something like complex PTSD, this can take a very long time to do. So you identify a trigger or a target, and then you would work through it with bilateral stimulation. They used to do this back and forth for hours, but then therapists were getting like shoulder and elbow problems. So now they have lights that you follow back and forth. Or as I said, tappers, on little buzzers that you'll hold in each hand. But really interesting and becoming more and more popular, exclusively for the most part, used for trauma. Any thoughts or questions or anything here? Yeah.
This has been making me think of this really great documentary that I watched recently. It's called The Act of Killing.
Okay.
And it's pretty much about, there are these fellows who they're part of this regime in Indonesia, and they help to perpetrate these mass killings of political dissidents and whatnot. And the director approached them and was asking them how they felt about their crimes, where most of them, they exhibited like no remorse and no attachment to their actions, where they depersonalized, dissociated from it. And what he did is he had them reenact the killings in different settings, where they would be like ranging from very direct or like very silly.
Okay.
Like, one of the guys, he said that he had bad dreams about what he had done. So they reenacted some of his dreams.
Sure.
And he said, he had idolized like American like noir and like gangster movie characters. So they had him act as an interrogee in like this noir situation. And pretty much what was happening is that they had built up like this psychological scar tissue, where they, being the perpetrators of these traumatic acts, but also being traumatized
by it as well
themselves, they had found ways to justify it, and they thought of it, rationalized it over and over. So directly reenacting it didn't really do much for them, but in a way that's like similar to EMDR, the altered reenactments, like the dreams and like the other filmic stuff, that actually got reactions out of them.
Yeah, interesting. You're kind of desensitizing through doing that as well, or kind of breaking up the scar tissue in a way, if we go with that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a lot of variants of this. That sounds like an interesting, I wrote it down, interesting documentary. Did you have a hand as well?
I was in a trauma therapy group earlier this year. I was at the rehabilitation program, and it was specifically for women, so women's experiences. And a lot of the women in the group, obviously not talking about what it was they experienced. Every individual had to, at the end of the 3 months, present a trauma timeline of their entire life, basically, and all their experiences. And a lot of the people in the group really struggled to even recall the traumatic experiences that they had been through in their life. It took a lot of work, like for some of them 6 to 9 months of staying in a program and speaking in group and different therapies and all that, to even realize, oh wow, this thing actually did happen to me. Is there like what is the evidence-based, is there evidence to suggest that, because a lot of times the therapists in the group would say that that's actually your body trying to protect you from reliving those experiences? It's almost like a defense mechanism.
Of course.
Is that like an evidence-based biological thing, or is that?
Yeah, so we call that repression. And that is a defense mechanism, right? When you repress memories, and very common with extreme stress, that you kind of block them out and repress them. I had a client who came in, and again, this is years ago, came in and was like, yeah, I had a pretty normal like childhood, like nothing like remarkable, and then like the longer we like met, it was like she hadn't in no way a normal childhood. It was almost like she had just blocked it all out, like her mom was emotionally neglectful. She had been locked in like a car in the garage, like when she cried, so that no one would hear it. Like little things started coming up, and we as a way of protecting ourselves, it's almost like we push it down. We don't want to think about it. And so oftentimes what's awful is when you go to treatment for these things, you can often get quite a bit worse before you get better, because those things start to come out, right? Like it's a way of protecting ourselves that we don't think about it. And then when you start to tackle it, you have to kind of relive it all in a way to a degree before it will get better. So yeah, there is some like support there. It is a very common thing when bad things happen to us, we repress them, we push them away, we rationalize them away. Freud talked a lot about that, the defense mechanisms. They're pretty common with trauma, unfortunately. Oops, clicking here. So the second half, or the last part of this chapter here, has to do with another way that trauma can manifest. So PTSD, I'm sure, again, a lot of you have known someone with this. It's relatively common, unfortunately. These disorders are not nearly as common, but they happen. Right? The dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders is a group, right? It's like a cluster of disorders that are, in general, not super common, but they do occur. And with these disorders, what we get is a lot of memory loss, sometimes separations of different parts of our identity, maybe even multiple identities within one individual. Oftentimes what you get here are something related to trauma. So a traumatic event that happened and you forget it. You block it out, kind of like we were just talking about with repression. Or maybe something traumatic happened and you develop multiple identities or personalities because the personality that experienced that trauma can't handle it. Right? So these, again, are not common, but they definitely do occur. And they're pretty wildly fascinating, especially dissociative identity disorder. So before we get to DID, dissociative amnesia is much more common, right? And so dissociative amnesia is when people have memory loss for an event or multiple events without any kind of physical or organic cause. Now, there's lots of movies, like there's stuff like The Vow, for example, or 50 First Dates, like movies where people have head trauma and they forget. That is not this. When you forget due to head trauma, that is a physical or organic reason that you are having memory loss. This is when people have memory loss because of something emotionally traumatic. So something really bad happens to you, and you can't remember all of it or elements of it or parts of it, maybe because of this dissociative amnesia. It's like your brain is trying to protect you by blocking it out, kind of like we were just talking about with repression. And this can happen in 5 different ways. This would be a great short answer question for you. What are the 5 types of dissociative amnesia? And I have them listed here, 1 through 5. I won't ask you the difference between the first 4, but this one is underlined. It's its own term. I might ask you more about that. But people can have localized, selective, generalized, continuous, or dissociative fugue. It's 5 different ways that this memory loss from a traumatic event can manifest. So when people have localized dissociative amnesia, and again, I won't ask you the difference between these first 4 because it's not always clear. What happens with this is it starts with the beginning of an event, of a traumatic event. Right, so oftentimes, like people who were in the Twin Towers on 9/11, right, they said they remembered the plane hitting, but they remembered nothing after that. So after the trauma starts, you remember almost nothing afterward. And again, it's your brain's way of protecting you. Selective, I think, is the easiest to understand. It's when you remember bits and pieces. Right? I remember how I got out of the building, but I don't remember what happened next. Or I remember little bits and pieces of the car accident, but not all of it. I don't remember how I got to the hospital or what happened afterward. Generalized is when people forget everything before the trauma. This is really, really rare. So people have a traumatic event and it's like they lose all memory of everything that happened prior to the traumatic event, sometimes even their identity. Continuous is when you can't remember anything after the event, and it goes on and on and on, even long after the trauma. So these are 4 different ways in the beginning here of how a traumatic event could be forgotten or repressed or blocked out because it was so traumatic your brain can't handle it. Now, the wildest one up here by far, in my opinion, is this 5th one, dissociative fugue. A fugue is Latin for flight. And with a dissociative fugue, people actually go on a long journey distance, typically away from their homes. They flee, right? Not necessarily on a plane, but like a flight away. And they oftentimes assume a new identity with no memory of who they were before. Now, with all of these, they tend to be temporary. All of them, they tend to come back. It might take some time, but they tend to come back. But this one, I think it's becoming harder and harder to happen because of like all the technology and all the documentation that we require as people to do the things that we do. But with a dissociative fugue, oftentimes people will get in a vehicle and just drive, and they end up states away, and they might have a different name, assume a new identity with no memory of who they were before. And it's brought on by stress and trauma. Every now and then this pops up in the news. I found a news story that shows a man who like had no memory of who he is. And again, it tends to come back. You start having moments of like, this doesn't seem right, things don't add up, and it can slowly kind of come back to you. But sometimes people do some damage in the meantime when they have completely forgotten about their previous identity.
This happened, and their like husband and kids like were the mother left. And
Okay.
she, like just got in a car and drive all the way across.
Wow.
And she didn't have like
The amazing.
I didn't realize how far away she was from the husband and her kids.
Okay.
And she was gone for like 3 or 4 months.
That's a long time.
And
And it almost feels unbelievable, right? Like it almost feels like something that would be hard to accept or believe, but it is something that is well documented. It does happen, but it's exceedingly rare. Again, someone takes off, starting a new identity with no memory of the old one. And typically it starts to come back in pieces. For him, he had one that lasted 9 months without remembering, but it's usually much shorter than, yeah.
We talked about truth serum, was that a placebo effect?
Yeah, so it's sodium pentothal, like it has like a hypnotic effect to it, where people are less inclined to like censor their responses. It won't necessarily force you to tell the truth, but it kind of removes your inhibitions, makes you more sedated, and it's almost like puts you in like an altered state that's similar to hypnosis, where you can oftentimes get answers out of people that they might not really get. So not like a perfect thing by any means, but trying to put him in an altered state where he might be more vulnerable to giving up some answers. So these ones, the first 4 happen more, especially the first 2. Those are relatively common. Fugue is pretty rare. But another example in this category, probably the most well-known of everything in this category of disorders, is dissociative identity disorder, or DID. Anyone know what this used to be called? This had a couple of names over the years. Yeah. Yeah, multiple personality disorder, or yep, or split personality disorder, right? So they renamed it. Rather than having multiple personalities, it's thought that you have disassociated identities, which is why they changed the name, because they're not fully developed personalities. They're like fragments of a personality. So we call it dissociated identity disorder, dissociative identity disorder, DID. And this disorder, again, not super common, but what you have here is somebody who has 2 or more personalities within one individual. Now, very common to have it be like 3, 4, or 5. The highest number documented is 126, right? That's super rare. It's usually like a handful of personalities. And we call these personalities subs or sub-personalities, right? Sub-identities. They're fragments of an identity that can routinely take over for the person who struggles with this. And the wild thing about this is it's often in response to trauma. So somebody experiences a traumatic event and they can't handle the trauma. So they create another identity that can handle it. And that identity takes over and can oftentimes last for years, it can last for days, it can last for months, it depends on the person. And sometimes people will develop multiple personalities to help them to counter that as well. And the relationship between the identities and personalities is what dictates how difficult this is to work with, right? There are 3 kind of general types of relationships that you can have between your sub-personalities. And the first one is by far the easiest. The first one's the hardest to deal with. The second one's the easiest to deal with. And the third is the most common. So mutually amnesic is the most the most difficult to deal with, I can't talk, most difficult to deal with because none of them know about each other. With mutually amnesic, what happens is none of the personalities know about each other. So there's an incredible amount of memory loss. When somebody is personality A, they have no idea what happened when they were personality B. They don't share memories. And so oftentimes this person can be very confused, very disoriented, and treatment is very, very difficult. If they all know about each other, which is number 2, that is a very easy one to work with. Because if somebody has 4 personalities, if A knows about B and B knows about C and C knows about A and they all know about each other, you can actually ask this person to switch. I'd like to talk to personality B, and B can come forward because they all share memories and they all know about each other. The most common is this last one, where there's like one dominant personality, and the dominant one knows about all the subs, but the subs don't know about each other, or that they are a sub-personality. And so with all of these, depending on the type of relationship, it dictates the treatment. If they all know about each other, then there's not a lot of memory loss. If they don't, there might be a lot of journaling that has to happen in order to like recall memories. And you oftentimes have to wait as the therapist for multiple personalities to emerge. Yeah.
Very voluntary, involuntary, like how
Sure.
can it be when to the therapist? Does any of the person take control of which personality to go?
It depends, right? So if they all know about each other, you actually can have quite a bit of control. So you could literally be like, I'd like to talk to your other personality, and they could bring that forward. Other times when it's more like the amnesic or one way, it's oftentimes triggered by stress or trauma. I don't know if any of you watched, just one of my favorite shows for a time, Bates Motel with Norman Bates. Such a good show. And they portray young Norman as having dissociative identity disorder. And so he switches personalities to like a personality that's almost like his mother when he commits the murders. And Norman has no memory of these murders. Thinks it's literally his mom and that his mom's committing these murders, but it's one of his personalities. And so if they're aware of each other, you have a lot of control. If they're not, then you're kind of, it tends to be triggered by stress or trauma, anxiety even. Yeah.
That'd be like Fight Club.
Fight Club isn't perfect, but yes, it's kind of the same idea of like you have like 2 different personalities that can switch. But they kind of blend a little bit of other stuff in there too to make it more entertaining.
Like what else would you say? The whole, like, Norman goes to sleep, Tyler is awake.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, and that whole idea of like one of them is asleep and awake, I think is pretty accurate, but there's a lot of like hallucination kind of stuff in there that isn't always the case. You can have that, but hallucinating is more like schizophrenia-like. So they kind of blend a little bit of schizophrenia and this together, but it's not awful. It's not an awful portrayal, and it's an entertaining movie, right? Yeah.
Transition into each other? Is it
Sure. Yeah, like you could start out one way and then they can become aware of each other later. And that's not uncommon either. And I've only once seen this in real life. I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever seen it in real life, but I've only seen it once, but it was a client of mine. And it was wild. At my first semester as a therapist trainee. So I'm like literally in first semester of grad school learning how to be a therapist. And I ended up having a client who had this and didn't know it, and I didn't know it. And it was incredibly memorable. I'll never forget it. I saw this young woman for, I want to say like maybe 6 or 7 weeks. And she was young, she was in college and was struggling with depression and missing her family. She was really like shy, really mousy, really quiet, and really sad. Like she was struggling with depression. I diagnosed her with depression. And I saw her for 6 weeks. She was the same every week, really timid, really quiet, really shy. And then she came in, it was like the 7th or 8th session, and she was so up, like talking a million miles a minute about people she had never mentioned, really like couldn't sit still. And in my head, I was like, oh, okay, maybe she has bipolar disorder. And I'm seeing the manic side for the first time. Right? As a therapist trainee, you are supervised. So they film everything. And you have to talk about the sessions with your supervisor afterward. And so my supervisor and I talked. We changed her diagnosis to borderline to bipolar disorder, and I didn't think much of it. But she showed up the next session, And the first thing she said to me, she's like, I want to apologize for not showing up last week. And I was like, oh no, but I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, you were here, but I'm glad you brought it up. Like, you were really different last week. And I'd like to talk about it a little bit more. And because she was back to timid and shy and quiet again and depressed. And she's like, no, like, honestly, I don't remember where I was last week, but I know I wasn't here. And I'm really sorry. That's not like me. Like, this means a lot to me. Like, I'm sorry I didn't come. And I was like, no. And I pulled out my notes and I'm like, you said this and you talked about these people and well, on and on and on. And she's like, I don't want to be rude, but I'm pretty sure you have me confused with somebody else. Like, I don't even know who you're talking about. That's not me. And I was like, yeah, I don't. I'm like, yes, like I'm in my mind. I was like, I'm not doing therapy here. It's you. I'm like, no, I know. And like, we went back and forth for like 10 minutes. It was all like, no, I wasn't here. Yes, I was, like back and forth. It was, she didn't remember coming. She didn't remember any of the things I had mentioned. No memory. And she couldn't remember that whole day, actually, because I was like, well, tell me, what else did you do that day? Let's try and go back and see if you can remember. Nothing, no memory of it. And we hit a point where we were like butting heads, it was all like, yes, you were, no, I wasn't. And so I went and got the film. I was like, if you don't mind, like, we couldn't move forward. And this was therapeutically important. Like, I knew it was important. And so I was like, if you don't mind, I'm going to go get the film from myself. And let's just check this. Let's put this to rest. Let's prove that you're wrong. No, that's not what I said. But I was like, let's check this, right? And so I went and got the film and put it on. And my supervisor came in at this point because I went out to get it. She's like, what's going on? I told her really quickly. And we put on the film and my client like starts crying. She's like, that's me. What am I wearing? I don't remember that. Who are those people I'm talking about? And I'm just sitting there like, my mind is blown. Like, this is why I love psychology. This is so fascinating. Like, what's happening right now? And it turned out, and my supervisor was there with us at this point. It turned out that she'd been having blackouts, all these periods of time where she didn't remember what happened or where she was. And it turned out that in response to the difficulty and stress of being at college, she developed a very extroverted personality that could handle being social and friendly to help out the personality that was shy and timid and missing her family. Now, I had to refer her out. I never got to see her again, which was like the saddest thing ever. But I was not qualified to help her at that point. This was like one of my first clients ever. And so she went and saw somebody else, but that is the only time in my life that I've ever seen this in person. I've seen it in the movies a ton, but she had no memory. So they were all unaware of each other. And it was so sad because I wanted to know what happened. To this day, I want to know what happened. And I have no idea because I wasn't allowed to follow up. But it can be like that. This is something that we tend to think is made up or people are faking. And I have to say that experience changed my perspective wildly on this. She was just so confused, no awareness and no memory of that whole session, just wild. And so again, this is usually something that's brought on by trauma, but it can be less than, it can just be brought on by anxiety or stress as well. I want to mention these two. I know we don't have a lot of time left. We're actually almost there, but depersonalization and derealization are two smaller forms of dissociation that sometimes people can experience. Depersonalization is when people feel like their body is like unreal or not part of themselves. And derealization is when the things around you feel unreal, right? If you remember, derealization, things feel unreal. And we talked about derealization with panic attacks. Sometimes when people are experiencing panic attack, the world becomes blurry or fuzzy and everything around you seems unreal, like you're not part of it in some way. Depersonalization is more when you feel like your body isn't your own. Okay? And these are two smaller forms of these dissociative disorders that can sometimes emerge. And they can be parts of other disorders as well. So people can have one of these or both of these. They're a little bit different, feeling that your world around you is unreal versus feeling like part of your body isn't yours or is not yours or is unreal in some way, if that makes sense. And the treatment with all of these is trying to understand what caused them and work through it. Right, so with dissociative identity disorder, there's no like pill you can give someone. It's a long and slow process. But with this, what you want to do is figure out what caused it identify the trauma, and then there's usually kind of like a 3-step goal. You help the client understand the nature of the disorder. You explain it to them. And the tricky thing with this is sometimes you have to explain it to every single personality before it hits home. And you might have to wait for those personalities to show up in order to be able to do that. You try and recover gaps in memory. Journaling, really wild. If you watch people who have this disorder, their journals, they might have different styles of handwriting, different tones, different ages, different grammatical abilities. When people have this disorder, sometimes we have them journal and we can track the changes much easier because you can see them visibly in their handwriting styles and the way that they record information. And then you try and integrate them into one. You try and do something called fusion, where you eliminate the need for these other identities. They usually have a purpose. And so if you can eliminate their purpose, then the identity goes away. Really interesting movie. It's getting old at this point, but it has John Cusack in it. It's called Identity. It's a good, like, scary movie, perfect for this time of year, but it has an awesome psychological twist. I won't ruin it for you, but it is all about this right here. There's a lot of links to what we're talking about. So I'll just put that out there if you're looking for something to watch. It's probably like 15, 16 years old at this point, but really cool portrayal of fusion and some of the stuff that we're talking about, giving away too much already. But with all of these, what we try and do is bring back, some of those forgotten memories and work through them, maybe through hypnosis or EMDR or just talk therapy, recover those gaps in memory, integrate them together, and we can get rid of those personalities. So sadly, it's a very long, slow process, especially if they're not aware of each other. It can take so long because you have to wait for them to emerge. If they are aware of each other, it can go much faster and be much more successful. So that tends to be, again, these usually are brought on by like a traumatic experience. It's an extreme repression. And then hypnotherapy and these 3 steps, we often use to try and kind of bring somebody back and eliminate some of those extra identities. Really wild and controversial, but it's definitely well documented, despite being a little bit rare. All right. Oh, sorry, a little quicker at the end there, but we got through all of it. I was hoping we would so that I wouldn't have to feel bad because we had to cover a little bit on your own. But remember, I will not see you on Wednesday. I will be here. So I will probably have a class before this, so I'll come in and I'll write it on the board. So if you show up and forget, you'll see it on the board, and when nobody's here, you'll probably remember very quickly. But remember, on Wednesday, if you take exam number 1, anytime between 12 in the morning and 11:59 p.m. at night, you will get a score instantly, except for the short answer questions, which I have to grade by hand. But please do that on Wednesday, so I won't see you then, but good luck. You'll all do beautifully. I know you will. And then I will see you on Monday and we'll start the second unit of that class.
Thank you.
Bye.
In case you're interested, there's also this really great